Good afternoon. I'm Lou Antoine with Job Service Kalispell. Thank you for joining us for the February Blueprint for Business Success webinar. Attendees are muted, but we encourage you to use the chat box for asking your questions, which will be answered at the end of the presentation as our time allows. As usual, we ask that your questions and comments are polite and respectful to our attendees and the presenters. There's a 2-minute anonymous survey at the end of today's event. We would appreciate you completing it. Your feedback helps us improve the program and offer future topics and content that is useful to our Montana businesses. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Cindy Carpenter, who holds the 2 top human resource certifications, the SHRM Senior Certified Professional and the Senior Professional in Human Resources. With a degree in business education from the University of Montana, she has over 25 years of business and training experience, primarily focused on human resource and people topics. To complement her training background, Cindy has been a practicing human resource professional in the banking, insurance, and manufacturing industries, as well as owning her own business, Carpenter Business Resources, LLC. And as a business owner and an HR professional, she understands the challenges faced by companies regardless of size or industry. Please welcome Cindy Carpenter.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today and thanks for having me. I'm sorry I got lost there for a moment because I forgot my picture was going to be up and I saw my dog, and that's Ranger. He's really an important part of everything I do. So appreciate everybody attending today. And I'm happy to talk about employee handbooks. I think it's a topic that we sometimes put on the back burner and that we shouldn't put on the back burner. I jokingly say that people use their employee handbooks to prop up their computer monitors or keep the door propped open, and that's probably not the best use of them. And so I hope today, as we take a little bit of a grassroots approach, we can look at our employee handbooks for those that have them, and maybe you'll do a relook, or maybe you'll think of something that's prompted by our talk today, or for those that don't have one, that you get motivated and excited to have one. So with that, we'll get started right away. And I'd like to start right off with a poll question, if we could. And I'll ask that we put that up there. So we'll just take a few seconds and ask of the group that's attending, how many of you do have an employee handbook currently? How many don't? And those who may be joining who aren't really sure where the status is of your handbook. So if you would quickly push through and give some answers to that, that would be wonderful. And let's see here. Yeah. Good. Already seeing some answers. And I just wanted to feel for it looks like most of you do have an employee handbook, but there are a few that don't. So that's great. We'll try to keep this with that in mind. So from my perspective as an HR professional, I think there is so much value that you can get out of your employee handbook. And it goes without saying, for those that have one, that you already know that there's all kinds of policies in there that you use, and there's somewhat of a protection for you. You know, there's the legal things that we absolutely have to have, but there's so much more that I believe that your handbook can offer you. Number one, it supports your company's culture and brand. And I'll probably drive this point home almost to death for you today, because I think this is where we are missing out so many times. Our handbooks are oftentimes templates or things that we've gotten from someone else that we've added bits and pieces to. And I don't know if we stop and look at that document as a reflection of our culture and our brand. And I think we really need to do that. And I'll continue to talk about that more as we go through today. Also, the handbook, for obvious reasons, it is the guidance for our performance and our behavior standards, the expectations that we set as a company. I think we all know that we want something out there, and that's why it shouldn't be the doorstop or the thing that props up your computer monitor, because this should be a resource for your employees. Obviously, the employee handbook should be informational. Think of your new employee. This is so important for them. This is their first impression of your company. Just like you're taking stock of them when they walk in the door on day one, they're doing the same with us as employers. And this is one of the first documents that they see, hopefully. If we're doing it right, hopefully it's one of the first documents we see. So think of how you want to be represented. This impression that they're getting of us comes from the handbook and how it looks and how we use it. We want to make sure that we're providing company history and beginnings. There are so many great stories out there of companies that have started with one product or one employee, or started in their basement or your garage, and now look where you're at. There's so many things to be proud of. This is the time you should stand up and wave the flag and brag a little bit about what you've done, and build that enthusiasm within your company and your employees as well. And as I've kind of alluded to and said, I think the value of a handbook also is that it should take the guesswork out of so many employee situations. If somebody's wondering whether or not they should punch in or they should log their time, the handbook is likely to tell them that, as one tiny example. Obviously, our handbooks are there to help us with a certain amount of protection. And as I say that, the HR in me has to remind you that you need to follow the rules that you have in your handbook. So they aren't just out there for your employees, they're out there for you as the employer to make sure that you're following the rules as well, and that you are on the same page with your current staff and with your new staff. So I guess the $1 million question is should you have a handbook? And overwhelmingly, from my perspective, yes, you should. For some of the things that I've already said, but just to reiterate, without some form of guidance, you're likely to have inconsistency within your employee interactions, and especially if you have more than one manager or leader. The handbook is a resource book. I'll say that multiple times today. And think of it this way. If you have a supervisor that's out in the field and you have a supervisor that's part of your accounting department, for example, we want to make sure that they're treating their employees equitably. And we want to make sure that the messages that they're sending are the same consistent message. The handbook helps to do that. So we don't have one person doing their own thing over here and another person over here doing something else. And even with simple situations or employee issues, they take much longer without these references and these resources. The handbook can help take care of the guesswork. So if it's an attendance issue, everybody's treating it the same way, instead of somebody over here ignoring it and someone over here wanting to fire someone because they were late one day. You know, that the opposite ends of the spectrum. So I really believe that the handbook can help you do all of this. As I say this, I always ask the question, well, what could be worse? Having a handbook that's out of date, or having a handbook that you don't follow because it's there, but you never look at it? Well, is that better than having no handbook at all? And I'm going to tell you from my perspective, no. You're almost better off not to have a handbook if you don't follow it, or if the one you have is currently out of date. So if it's something you did years ago because you thought you should have one and you've not taken a look at it, I'm going to recommend that you think about all the things you should be taking a look at as we go through our topics today. And keep in mind that you don't want to be in a situation where you're not following your handbook, because maybe that's going to cost you not only monetarily in terms of maybe an unemployment claim or something potentially even worse, but also because it can affect your reputation. And what you don't want is to be known as the employer who doesn't take care of their employees or doesn't follow their own policies. You know, that's that bad reputation. And that talks about the culture that I referred to begin with. Companies that are doing it right are building their culture and ultimately the engagement of the employee. So what should your handbook goal be? Again, I'll tell you this so many times today. I think it should be a reflection of your company, the brand, the culture that you wish to have. I think it should tell your story. It should provide information about your business, including the history, and maybe equally as important now because we want to be forward thinking. What are your goals? What's your number one overriding reason you're in business? And what's the passion that you have for the product or the service that you have? And that should be part of your handbook. Again, it's driving culture. It's letting all of your employees know exactly what the expectations are and hoping that they'll engage, that they'll buy into that. It does provide what I call the rules of engagement, or the household rules or the rules of the road. It isn't meant to be so specific that no one can breathe. What it is meant to be is some guidance for everyone so that they can, again, use the book as a resource, and they can say, oh, I don't know what we do about that, but let me look in the handbook because I bet it talks about it there. You want to take the guesswork out of it. As we all know that if there's not something in place, the imagination of our employees can go crazy. And the next thing you know, things are completely out of hand, or at least not where you want them to be. So again, the handbook goal is to be a resource, taking care of those housekeeping items. You'll notice that nowhere in my goal setting do I talk about this being a punitive document. And we'll talk more about that. I don't want you to hold your handbook out there as a hand slap for your employees. It should be, this is how we are a team. This is how we grow together. This is how we build what we're doing. So keep that in mind as you relook your handbooks for those that have them. There are some important components to think about. This is not only important for those that already have a handbook, but for those who are contemplating what your handbook should look like. First of all, it's full of policies, and we always know that. But most of your policies that you're looking at, particularly those that are in every handbook, are written to meet legal standards, both federal and state. So if you have an old handbook and you haven't looked at it in a while, you want to make sure that you're always paying attention to what current legal outcomes are going on out there. One example that I can give you will be the fact that in Montana last year we changed the length of a probationary period if you don't name it. So it used to be 6 months if you didn't have a named probationary period in your handbook. Now it's 12 months. I saw someone in a recent handbook that I reviewed for a client, and they had the wording down there and they had never updated that wording. So again, you might know that it's 12 months, just make sure that your handbook is reflecting accurate information. I also want to stress that policies should be written so that they reflect you and your internal and daily operations, not only within your policies, but the processes and procedures that you have. It doesn't do any good to use a template that doesn't reflect your business. It won't make sense, and it won't fit, and it certainly won't drive culture. We'll talk more about this in detail as we go through today. Again, your handbook needs to fit your business model. Okay, just a couple of examples here. You may have employees that work remotely. That wasn't something we worried about prior to March 2020, but now it's a part of our lifestyle. But you also may have employees that work out in the field, like in the construction industry, and they may not be in the office every day. Or you have people who are hybrid, and sometimes they're working out of their home offices, or sometimes they're working in-house or on-site. You might have things that are unique to you. For example, in the medical fields, there are usually lots and lots and lots of rules about confidentiality, both patient and customer, and as well as the business. So there may be things about your handbook that are directly unique to you as a business. And that just goes without saying then that policies should be applicable to the type of business that you have. It's a different lifestyle for retail versus hospitality versus a manufacturing component or construction or just a general office environment. What works for me in my little office, I bring my dog to work, might not work in retail or manufacturing, for example. And obviously there might be certain industry standards or requirements. those of you in manufacturing that are on the call today, clearly you have a lot more to consider with regard to safety than maybe somebody who's just working in an office and providing a service of a different nature. So again, as you're looking at your handbook, think about what are the key components that need to be in there based on the business that you're in. And then do a double check to make sure that you actually have those in there and that they're current. I told you I was going to beat this to death, and I'm bringing it up again. I really do believe your handbook is a reflection of your culture, and I want to drill down on that just a little bit more. How do you want to be known? I know based on, I looked at the attendees, and I know I have some recruiters out there, and they're going to chime right up and tell you how hard it is right now to find staff, and all of you already know this. So what is your culture, and how do you want to be known? And we really need to focus on that when we think of our handbook. Yes, we've got some legal policies, of course, but we need to think about how this resource book or this guidebook can be really tuned into who we are. I strongly feel that your welcome and your introduction should create that vision. And well, I'm not joking when I say this, but most of you know, particularly those who have handbooks, you give that handbook to the employee, and maybe you even go through part of it with them. Every one of them will sign off saying they read that, and we all know that probably 90% of them don't read the handbook from start to finish. There's lots of reasons for that, but one is perhaps that the document is just boring, and secondly is we didn't catch their attention in order to get them through it. We didn't let them know our expectations clearly, or any number of things. We generally expect that they will read the welcome and the introduction, so you need to do a bang-up job there in getting that blast of information to them that talks about who you are and what your key components are, and just build the excitement in those employees. And I just threw some ideas out here on this screen, but what is your focus? Is it because you're a quality operation, or is it because you are driven by volume, or because you have a quick turnaround time? Is it because you're a flexible working environment, whatever your industry might be? Or maybe you're just plain out fun. We've seen organizations who are recruiting say, we have fun here. You know, we're building a culture that appeals to those people who are really wanting to go out and have a good time. Or it might be longevity, both of the business and of the staff. Just as I was working on this presentation a couple weeks ago, I saw on the television, it's an auto body business in Missoula, and I'm sorry, I could tell you where to find it, but I don't remember the name of it right now. And the business, their entire ad is about the number of years that they've been in business, and then they spotlight not just 1 or 2 employees, but like 6 or 7 employees in this 30-second commercial that have 30 years or 25 years or 22 years, 14 years. I think the lowest one was 10 years. So they have a culture. They're already letting you know just in that advertisement. And I bet if we saw their handbook, it would be the same thing. We have been around a long time. We know what we're doing. We're here for you. We stand behind our product. That's the message they were giving in that commercial. So think about that as you're thinking about your handbooks. You might be a conservative company, and that's part of your pride and your expectation. Or conversely, you might be very progressive. You're going to throw all that old stuff out the door, and we're going to try something new. You might have a one-of-a-kind product or service, and lots of companies I work with want to be known for extraordinary customer service. And a lot of people talk about that. Not everybody delivers it, but it's up to you how you drive that into your culture and your handbook. Maybe you're the best of the best. Maybe it's because you're always available, or maybe because it's something simple like we're clean and wholesome company, you know, and who are you appealing to? So there's a little bit of marketing going on here, but it's also your culture. Think about that as you review your handbooks, or if you're creating one, What are some key things that you know you want to be known as? Keep in mind, as I said before, that handbook is the first document a new employee sees. It's part of their first impressions, just like what you are with them. And also, it's culture consistency. You want to make sure that even for your existing and current staff who might be using this as a resource, that they understand that every page they turn to, every policy they see, every procedure that's going on is a reflection of your culture. So when you decide on your policies, there's some things to consider. This is by no means an all-inclusive list. We only have an hour today. And as much as I love to visit with you, we'll have to assume that there are some things that you will grab out of this as well. But there are some policies we know that are essential no matter what your business is, right? But some do depend upon the nature of your business. Again, safety. If you handle machines of any kind, or if you're in the cleaning business and you have lots of hazardous chemicals that you have employees working with, if you have company vehicles that are driven by your employees, or beyond even driven, what if they're taken home at night by your employees? Do you have a product or information that's proprietary and therefore extremely confidential? It doesn't necessarily, it could be a software. It could be that you're in the service industry and the software that you've created is yours and yours only. There's definitely a level of confidentiality there that you want to make sure that you have. Think of the difference between Coca-Cola and Pepsi. You can bet that they have confidentiality written all over every one of their handbooks, right? You have to also consider how many employees do you have, because there are certain things that have to be in your handbooks, or at least should be in your handbooks. If you have, for example, family medical leave, if you have 50 or more employees, everybody should be understanding what the Montana pregnancy leave is. It applies to everybody. Would be the same with the military leave under USERRA. And we have some experts that I know are watching today and absolutely would tell you how important it is that we have an understanding of that. Here's one other thing to think about in your policies. I'll touch on this a little bit more later on, but if you offer a full slate of benefits and they happen to change frequently, like every year when you're going through all the open enrollment processes, you might consider hosting the details of your benefits in a separate handout so that you're not always updating your handbook just for that single purpose. It doesn't mean that you don't talk about your benefits in the handbook, but what it does mean is maybe you don't provide lots of detail and all of the specifics about this. For example, we offer our retirement plan through Edward Jones, or where our insurance is currently through Blue Cross Blue Shield or Pacific Source or wherever. You might just talk about the fact that you offer medical, dental, and vision insurance. Just some things to think about as you are, again, either creating or reviewing your handbook. I do want to take a minute and talk about the difference between policies and procedures. And the reason I do this is because when I review handbooks, which I do a lot of for clients, some of their handbooks come to me and they're 60 and 70 pages long. And no wonder they didn't get read from cover to cover, because they're so long. So oftentimes when I look at them, I see that people have put policies in there, but they've also put detailed procedures in their handbooks. And I often think that there's a better use of your handbook than all of the detailed procedures. Again, mostly because those can change, but also because I don't think that they're more part of your day-to-day operations and not so much about your handbook. So I have just some examples here that we can talk through. Let's think about time cards and attendance, for example. Attendance is extremely important to all of you, and I understand that. So we definitely want some attendance verbiage in our handbook. Probably more of this is our expectation, that you come to work on time, that you are not late, and that if you don't follow our attendance processes, there will be some form of disciplinary action or penalty. But things like, who do I call when I'm going to be late? that's probably not necessary in your handbook. Now, I know some of you have that in there, and if it works for you, I'm not saying you have to change it, but I would give some consideration to the level of detail that you put in there. A perfect example is it used to be that when you called in sick, you had to call your supervisor on the phone and you could only talk to them. Times have changed significantly, and now many people will accept a text message or a voicemail or an email. And so that process is a procedure. Who do I call? How should I let someone know if I'm not going to be to work and if I'm going to be late? That's more of a procedure to me, and I think that goes somewhere else besides the handbook. I think if you want your handbook to be the best resource document and be read, it needs to be less than 60 pages. Same with time cards. It's absolutely okay to say we track time for the purposes of paying you, but it doesn't, somebody might clock in on a time clock, somebody might write down their time on some sort of sheet, somebody might log in on their computer. Everybody's different, and so that's more of a procedure. Same with the accident report process. Obviously, we want to make sure everybody understands that if there's an accident or they've had an accident, that we want it reported immediately. But it's not good to put in there to find the investigation or accident report form, go to Cindy's office, because Cindy might not be the person next time that has that form. So I think you get where I'm going with that. Same with COVID. If you had put a COVID policy in your handbook, not necessarily just an addendum, but a policy in your handbook in March 2020, when we started this crazy mess, you would have changed it at least 10 times between then and now. So you probably have a process going on in your organization about whether or not you are exposed, whether you've tested positive, whether somebody in your immediate family tests positive, quarantine times have changed, all of it. There's the whole vaccination issue. I think you probably have an off-site procedure, or it's not part of your handbook, and that's what I would recommend. Not that you don't have a pandemic policy, but it's probably a little bit more generic in nature. That doesn't mean you couldn't attach, for example, that accident report form as an attachment to your handbook, particularly for those of you who do it online. You could do the same thing with the notice of first report, accident and investigation form, or time off request, maybe even a COVID form if you have one. I'm not saying you don't necessarily acknowledge that those things exist, but I do think that they don't belong as part of the whole content. So with that, I'd like to try for another poll question right now. If I could ask my friends at the job service to put that up. Great, thank you. So this poll question says, how many of you add any historical information about your company in the handbook? Maybe you do it during the welcome portion or at some other point. And if you could just take a few seconds and answer that question for me, I would appreciate it. Great, thanks. Thanks. So there's a good response there. That looks like, probably over 50% of you, or well, it looks like 60% do put some sort of historical information about your company in the handbook. But there is about 30% or a little more, between 30 and 40%, who either don't do it or are not sure. So thank you for that answer. Again, you've heard me say, I think that you can add a lot of value by doing so. So this is the kind of the second part now as we go through our presentation, and I want to make sure I don't forget to tell you this. If you are interested in having this presentation, the actual PowerPoint, my contact information will be up at the end, and I'm more than happy to send it to you, because where we're going right now is I'm going to give you this quick reference sheet, and I'm also going to then break it down in a little bit more detail in a little bit different format of how you might structure your handbook. And I need to start this part off by saying there is no one right way. If you're comfortable the way your handbook is structured now, and you feel it flows right, and you feel it's giving you the right message and your new employees or your existing employees the right message, then you may not need to change it. But for those of you who are thinking, gosh, I don't even know about my handbook, or I don't even think it feels right, here's one way you could look at it. I mean, it's kind of simple, but again, I promised grassroots here. You might take a whiteboard and you might just take every one of these that are on your screen, you know, the welcome, history, mission, vision, values, and make a category, and then make one for equal employment, and one for conflict, and one for employment relationship, or safety, or time off, or benefits. And by doing that, then you could plug in where you think your policies might fit, or the things that you think are important for your organization or your industry. Just because we have templates, which by the way, we do have templates out there, and there are references today that will give you, that doesn't mean you have to follow that exactly and in the exact order that they come to you in, because maybe it doesn't feel right, again, depending upon your particular business. But here is just one way to look at it. I like to see the welcome and that history, that historical information, and at the welcome is also at the beginning, when we know everybody's still reading and paying attention, to get your mission, vision, and values in there. And maybe that is the same thing as your goals. Not everybody has specific mission, vision, and values, but you have something that drives you every day to get up and come to work and to have a business. So whatever that is, this is a good place for it. Then there's some of those, what I call the legal stuff, you know, equal employment, diversity and inclusion, which I'm going to talk about more in another slide. Whether or not confidentiality is a big thing. Remember, I said if you're a medical office, for example, you may have some very strict rules about confidentiality. Things with the employment relationship, and we'll drill down further, or safety might be a separate section for you. The guidelines, here's that kind of nuts and bolts, the rules of the road under guidelines. Time off seems to be a big thing for people, so many times I see time off as a separate section, because your employees will go back there and go, well, I don't remember if I can work the day before this holiday, or I have to, or I can't remember how long I have to be here before I can take time off, or I think I get some personal days and all that good stuff. So maybe you have it as a separate section. And again, this is only one reflection of a handbook here. And then benefits, and lots of things can go into your benefits, because after all, you are doing a lot of benefits for your employees, even if you don't offer traditional medical or dental insurance. And then obviously the acknowledgement, which is a key component. All right, let's kind of break this down just a little bit more. And again, you're going to find that some of the things I do in the next few slides may even look just a little bit different than that last slide, because I want to make sure you understand that there is not a have-to way to do things. But in your welcome, I think that's the key. You're right here. This is your one shot and your best shot to grab their attention and get them engaged on day one. Greet them properly. Talk about your business and your culture. What is the nature of the business? What makes you unique? What's your ownership? For some people, if you're in a publicly traded company, that ownership is important, because there's all kinds of laws that go along with public, you know, companies that are publicly traded. It may be that there's a single owner. It might be that there's an absentee owner. These are all things that help build the vision of your company. What you're doing in your welcome is setting the stage for the employer or an employee relationship. And lastly, where I see this almost always for most of you, is that somewhere in that welcome, you make the statement that says the handbook is not a guarantee of employment. And that's absolutely fine to do that there. So as we kind of drill down some more, I would tell you, obviously, equal employment. You know, just the HR and me can't resist. I have to remind you that it's your responsibility. I think this is where you include a statement about retaliation. Excuse me. And again, the HR in me says make sure you're practicing it wholeheartedly when you're hiring and promoting. You might have something in your handbook about the Americans with Disabilities Act. For those of you with 15 or more employees, you absolutely should have it in there. And then diversity and inclusion. This is my new favorite topic, right alongside of employee handbooks. Diversity and inclusion is all about maintaining a workplace that we can all participate in and that everyone is valued for what they bring to the table, their skills, abilities, and experience. It's one thing to put the policy in there, but I'm telling you that the key to a great culture and to the companies that are really kicking tail right now is that they're practicing inclusion. They're recognizing that everybody is different, everybody brings value to the table, and that we need to embrace it because together we are much better as a whole. And that allows us to build a better culture, to have a stronger company, to have a better team, to build a better product, and to relate to all different types of customers. So again, I really feel that this is a strong part of your handbook. And I drill on this and I shout it out because I've talked about your managers and your supervisors being knowledgeable about your company and about the handbook. Here's good reminders for them as well, because they're the ones dealing with the employees probably the most frequently. You should have a harassment and complaint procedure. I do think this is critical. I say there, consider an open door policy. We know that we would like every one of our employees to take their concerns first to their supervisor and then to another leader if necessary. And we hope that 99% of their concerns are things that are just quickly fixed or we discover what the issue is, in most part likely because it's a communication problem. And we hope that that's how most of our problems are resolved, is through an open door policy. And I think it's good to have that. But in the event you have something more serious going on, having a formalized complaint procedure is particularly important. And it's necessary because, as you know, harassment that's based on any of our protected classes is illegal if proven. And that complaint procedure is a formal process that both you and the employee agree to follow in order to resolve whatever that complaint is. So again, there are templates out there that you can use, but it's critical that you follow them. Then I go on to employment relationship. Here's a really big section in your handbook as a general rule. And I'm just put a few things in here. There's probably even more, but let's start with these and you can build from that. If perhaps you already have some other things in your handbook. Here's where you talk about whether somebody is a full-time status and what that means, or part-time. You may even have on-call or temporary. If you're in a seasonal business, you're likely to have temporary employees. They might be, you might define exempt versus non-exempt or hourly. Here's where you would probably put in your probationary or introductory period. Again, if you don't define it, Montana says it's 12 months. And for some of you, 12 months makes absolute sense. For others, that may not be the right number, and maybe it's 6 months or 90 days. Here's also where you're going to define your work week, the hours of operation, whether or not you offer rest and meal breaks officially. How is your timekeeping handled? And this is about overtime. Everybody who works more than 40 hours in the work week is eligible for overtime. This is about when your paydays are and your paychecks, whether or not you offer direct deposit perhaps, might include whether you have standard pay deductions, whether or not you offer access to personnel files, and if so, under what circumstances. Some of you say, yes, you will, but they have to request it in advance, for example, and files can't leave the premise. You might have a policy about whether or not you employ relatives or domestic partners. Or, and I think this is a very important one, whether you put it here or somewhere else, separation from employment. This is the general process, and here's the one time where there are some procedural things that I think are okay. You know, this is, we'd like you to give us at least 2 weeks notice. We intend to do an exit interview. You will be paid your final paycheck at the next payday. And remember, this is not only for people who are resigning, but people who might be being involuntarily terminated. You must define whether or not they get their paycheck at the next payday. If you don't, according to Montana Code Annotated, you do have to pay them within, I think it's 4 hours. So these are where you might put those details. And I'm sure you have some more that you all know or have already. Here's workplace safety. Again, for those of you in manufacturing or some other areas, you may have an entire section dedicated to safety. The one key thing I'm going to put in here is we all are a little concerned these days about what our drug policies should say, particularly because marijuana is legalized in Montana, although it's not legal federally. And I am here to tell you, I'm not an attorney. And if you are at all concerned about what your policy says, I encourage you to consult an attorney. But it's absolutely okay for all of you to say that you expect to have a drug-free workplace and a safe environment. You might put things in there that with regard to handling of equipment or materials, for example, you might even say in there, we do have forklifts, but no one may drive them unless they're certified or something like that. This is where you might put in violence-free, workplace bullying. Don't kid yourself, folks, there is an increase in workplace violence. We've seen an uptick in a lot of bummer type things in the last 2 years, domestic violence, drug use, etc. So these are important policies. And then you could put workers' compensation in this policy as well. It can go in other places, but it can go here too. And when I talk about workers' compensation, it's mostly that we're saying, yes, you are covered, and we want to have immediate reporting of any accidents, no matter how small. I think, again, most of you are aware of that. Here's another one with lots of small print, but here's my guidelines or the rules of the road. Here's how we set expectations. So here's where you might put your code of ethics and business conduct. I think these are important policies. That conflict of interest, whether or not you allow outside employment and what it might look like. Confidentiality could go here. Here's where you might put this stuff about attendance, that it's tracked, that there might be consequences, not necessarily who you contact. You might have your pandemic policy here. You might also have a remote working policy. It's a policy not everybody used to have, but it's pretty common anymore. I think your remote policy should be a fairly simple 3 to 4 sentences. And in general, it talks about the fact that you may offer it. It's on a case-by-case basis. It's not a guarantee, that kind of thing. I recommend you get a signed agreement on that, and we don't have the time to necessarily talk about that. That's more of an operational thing, but I encourage that. I also want to point out that, and it's on these slides, and I will have the link for you, the job service does have a remote working kit that you could utilize if you are trying to incorporate this into your current handbooks. Here's also why you might talk about performance management, whether or not you do performance management. If you say that you review everybody at the end of their probationary period, I think the better words are to use, we strive to do it. When you make promises in your handbook that you aren't able to keep, that reflects poorly on you and won't be in your favor if things go wrong. Same with your annual performance reviews. It's our custom, it's our practice to do annual performance reviews, or we strive to do them if that's what you do. Here's also where you talk about the use of company assets, particularly the internet and the computer. Whether or not you don't want people downloading software on your computers that will create virus problems and shut your systems down. You might have policies about equipment. This is, again, on a fairly generalized level, with the exception maybe about protecting passwords and things like that. Disciplinary policy, I think it has to be in here. This is a good spot for it if you have one. Again, my HR side of me says make sure you're consistent in your use of it. Most everybody seems to do progressive discipline anymore, and I think that's a good policy. You can put right in there that you reserve the right to skip the steps depending upon the seriousness, if you will. Social media is another one that didn't used to be out there, but a lot of companies are talking about it now. We want to make sure that your employees understand that you don't want them representing you on social media unless they have your permission. So if they're out there on their Facebook page talking, it should be a reflection of their personal opinion. And of course, as it reflects to confidentiality. And for those of you who have travelers, people who do a lot of traveling, you may wish to have a travel policy. Your handbook can get quite a few policies in it, but this is just a sampling for you to see what things absolutely make sense. And then benefits. I think for me, benefits, time off might fit in here. Do you offer it and how? But again, benefit or time off could be a separate section, or it could be under the guidelines or under the relationship. Leave of absences. I consider these a benefit for your employees. So you might need to address more than one form. Being consistent. There's the USERRA or military leave of absence. Montana has a pregnancy leave act. You could have personal leave of absences, people who request time off to go back to school, for example. Or it could be that you're under family medical leave and you have that leave of absence. Medical, dental, and vision are benefits. Remember, I said I think the details are best on a separate handout. You may offer life insurance or short or long-term disability, or a retirement plan or 401k. Employee assistance programs for those of you who try to find some different perks, or you might put work comp in here because it is a benefit. Or if you offer everybody a gym membership, that might be a benefit that you put in there. Or a discount on goods or services, that might be a benefit that you put in here. You might even talk about the holidays in here. That could be a part of the relationship. It could be part of benefits if you offer holidays off or closures. So as we are kind of coming close to the end of our time here, I'd like to do one more poll question if I could. And I'll ask my friends, thank you. How often do you review your employee handbook? And we've kind of broken it down between less than a year, or every 1 to 2 years, or not sure, or don't remember. So if you take just a moment and respond to me on that, please. Cool, all right, thank you. So 30% do less than a year, that's good. 30% about 1 to 2 years, and 40% saying not sure. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic, and hopefully one of your takeaways today is go out there and look at that handbook. So I've kind of quickly run through our policies there. There are a few things that I call my additional to-dos that I want to make sure that we talk about as we start to come towards the end. One of them is always get a signed acknowledgement of your handbook. And I know this is enough to pull your hair out because I've been a practicing HR person, and it seems like you're chasing down, or worse yet, you're in the first day of orientation, you give them the handbook, you cover 1 to 2 key policies, and then they sign it right there and want to hand it back to you when you know that they haven't read it yet. So take a look at what your signed acknowledgement says. It may in fact be that you hand out the handbook to everybody and you don't go over it with them in great detail. So maybe your acknowledgement says that they have acknowledged that they've received a copy and they agree to read and understand. Okay. Some of you will say, look, I want you to get back to me, or we're going to go through this on day 2 or 3. Orientation practices differ for every company, and I'm not suggesting you have to change that necessarily. I am saying it's absolutely essential that you get this signed acknowledgement. And most every unemployment claim where there's a concern or any other commission question, or if someone goes to the Human Rights Commission and they file a complaint, this question gets asked every time. Did they receive a copy of your handbook? Do you have a signed acknowledgement? I think that you should review your handbook at least annually. It potentially could be more frequently if you have lots going on in your company. That's why I suggest that, because it's so frequent, that benefits, if they're changing all the time, you give that separate handout, because frequent changes mean frequent tracking and getting those acknowledgements. Every time you make a change to your handbook, it's critical that you get a new signed acknowledgement. And in fact, if you're making lots of changes, sometimes it's really helpful to the employee to identify those key changes with a separate handout. I know it's hard to bring all your people together to have meetings to go over handbook changes, and I also know that it takes away from production. I am here to say that it's really important, and you can use it as a team building and a tool as a resource guide if done properly, but that doesn't happen, and I understand that. Make sure you're getting those acknowledgements. If you make changes that are significant, please provide plenty of notice, at least 30 days or more, to the employee, and again, get that new signature. Let me give you an example. If you are going from perhaps a semi-monthly payroll to a bi-weekly payroll, that's a big deal for your employees. Most of us live on paycheck to paycheck, and if they're having to change their budget strategy from getting paid twice a month to getting paid every other week, you need to give them time to do it. So I often see that we go through our handbook review, if you're on a calendar year, seems like it starts in October, November, when all of the open enrollment's going on, and we're kind of getting all these things changed and done. And we try to get our handbook changes out by about the 1st of December so that they can be effective January 1. You know, that may or may not be the right process. I know it happens to be your busiest time of year, but keep in mind that all these things tag along with each other. Really important to give them plenty of notice. And I know that many of you have in your handbook that you reserve the right to make changes to this handbook, but the fact of the matter is it's not the right thing to make changes and not tell your employees with plenty of notice. Again, it's all about your culture. It's about being and doing the right thing. It's really important that everybody, including your owners and your leaders, are familiar with the handbook, especially your managers and supervisors who are frontline. This should be their document. Nobody should have the excuse that I didn't know that that was in the handbook. That just isn't an acceptable excuse anymore. I've said this early on, but I want to come back to it one more time and say, this is not supposed to be the penalty book or the penalty document. I'm guilty of having used it that way myself before, but if we really change how we think about the handbook, this is our reference guide. This is how we can use it as a resource. This is how we build our culture. This is how we set the standards of our operation. And if someone blows it and has an issue, then yes, we're going to refer to the fact that they knew about it. We're going to follow the process of disciplinary procedure, which was in the handbook. So yes, it is there to keep us in order. It's also there to protect the company as well as the employee. Pretty critical that we think in a different light about our handbook. And lastly, I really think it's important to say, you know, I really do believe that you should have your handbook go through legal review. And it's interesting, I review a lot of handbooks, a whole lot. And it's so interesting to me how many people will say, well, you looked at it, Cindy, so why do I need to? I'm looking at it from the way that I just spoke to you about in the seminar or webinar. If you take a handbook where you've gotten templates from somebody, or you've borrowed someone else's handbook and now you've changed it up or done a few other little things, you may have done something that will cause you trouble later on, and that's what an attorney should be looking at for you. Very important to do that. I also want to, there's a question in chat. I'm sorry, I just realized I was supposed to be looking at chat, my mistake. It says, what are your thoughts on including pictures or icons in the handbook as a means of visual engagement? And I love that because again, people are sometimes way more visual with pictures and icons. Just make sure that regardless of the number of people that you have and the differences in their abilities and capabilities, that handbook is not confusing to use, or that it's all icons and not necessarily some printed matter. And that's the reason I say that, is because I am the worst person with instructions that are all about little diagrams. And so I want someone to spell it out for me, where other people want something a little bit different. So again, great question, and thank you for that. I believe that takes me to the end here. And I'll leave it open for questions or comments. We could talk about this all day long, but hopefully I've given you some things to think about, or toggle something there that says, oh, I want to go look at that in my handbook. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lewis, or I think it's Lewis.
It's Lou, but Lewis, either way, that's fine, Cindy. Wonderful presentation, great information and guidance. I'm glad you started with that first question from Autumn. We do have a couple other ones that we want to try and get in the 5 minutes we have remaining. Another question is, when making updates and changes to the handbook, why do you recommend giving a 30-day notice to the employees?
Again, I briefly touched on that before, but it's a great question to come back up, and thank you for that, because it's so important to give your employees plenty of time to make adjustments in their lives if you're making significant changes. And it might be that we're changing our attendance policy, or it might be that we're changing our benefit providers. It might be that we're changing how you get your pay or whatever. So really important to do that.
All right, Cindy, also another question. How can you make sure the employees are reviewing the handbook?
You can beat them over the head. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. It's persistence. And I know that we can't babysit our employees, or that we don't want to, but try some different ways of doing it, because not everybody is computer access, particularly those of you who are people out in the field. So maybe you have small group meetings, maybe you do morning huddles, maybe you just ask your direct supervisors and managers to sit down with them and have them collect them. And sometimes it's a follow-up process. It's just persistence. There is no one right way, but I can't stress enough how important it is to get them to actually use the handbook in a way that's beneficial.
Okay, we have time for another quick question. Do you need to give a hard copy of the handbook to every employee?
Well, no, you don't necessarily need to do that, but you should make something available. Again, keeping in mind that not everybody has access the same way. So if you're in an office environment and you have an intranet or you have an online copy, that might be fine, but that's not so easy to use for those people out in the field, perhaps. So depending upon your business, make sure that they have access to it. That's the key.
All right, Cindy. Very, very highly informative presentation. We had great questions. That's all the time we have for today. So a huge thank you to Cindy Carpenter for gifting her time and sharing her expertise in human resources. Following a few announcements, we will leave Cindy's contact information up. Our next Blueprint for Business Success seminar will be Retention Strategies on March 22nd. You won't want to miss that next month. Thank you in advance for completing the survey when you leave today. Remember, your feedback helps us improve our program and provide meaningful topics and content. Once again, thank you for attending. Cindy's information will be available along with some future classes she'll be teaching.